I'd now like to introduce Rachel Mander to you. And I think the best thing is to ask you, Rachel, to tell us about yourself before going in and taking us through what we can each do about COP26. So over to you.
Wonderful. Well, the first thing to say is thank you for having me. And I'm here tonight speaking in a personal capacity, but I hold a number of different roles with different organisations. So I work 3 days a week with Hope for the Future. I'm their Faith Outreach Officer. So I work with faith communities to help them build effective relationships with MPs around climate change. I work 1 day a week with A Rocha International as their Theology and Churches Officer. And I work 1 day a week with Faith of the Climate as their COP26 Liaison Lead, coordinating a group of faith-based organisations in the run-up to COP26. I live in Sheffield. I've been here for a year and a half now, and I really like it. I think that's enough of a brief introduction.
Okay, and you're going to show us your slides and take us through that. Yes,
I will do. Great. So I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes. So apologies that it's lots of me talking. As I'm speaking in a personal capacity, you'll see that I've put my personal email address there if you want to take anything up with me after this session this evening. And what I'm going to speak to is, first of all, some context for the year, some international background to COP26, and then the UK as host. And then follow that up with what we do, some of the different things going on, and some of them will be more or less applicable to what you want to get involved in, but that's totally fine. And there'll be some space for questions and answers afterwards as well. So context. First of all, this year, so looking at the year ahead, we've just been past February. I know that you'll be familiar with the Show the Love campaign, because I know that you had a prayer on that theme. Coming up in June, we have the G7, which the UK is hosting in Carbis Bay, Cornwall. In September, that's sort of the kind of run-up approach towards COP. So we're expecting that to be quite an important month in terms of some of the mass mobilisation within civil society in the UK ahead of COP26. And that becomes more important because of the COVID situation, and actually it won't be as accessible for other activists travelling from other places. And then finally in November, we will have COP26 itself. It's happening from the 1st to the 12th of November up in Glasgow. And COP stands for Conference of Parties, and 26 is it's the 26th COP that's happened. They usually happen annually, but this one was postponed from last year. And so a kind of reminder, this is a quote from Chris Stark. He's the chief executive of the renamed Climate Change Committee. This quote is now, I think, about 18 months old, but nevertheless still very helpful. And he says COP26 is a major milestone for the international effort, and it's also the date by which the UK must have raised its own ambition, with real policies and programmes to put on a credible path to net zero by 2050. And so I guess this is the joint side of COP26. It's a really important lever for us as people living in the UK, for our own government, to put in place the things that it needs to. And at the same time, it's also really important internationally. And hopefully both things will be touched on within this. Brief reminder of where we are. I know that many of you will be familiar with this graph, but we are in a serious situation. The level of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere measured in parts per million just keeps rising. And so that is why we have these COPs in the first place. There's an international recognition that we need to act and change what we're doing. And the main vehicle for doing this is via the UNFCCC, that's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that's the body that oversees the COPs. As I mentioned before, this is the 26th COP, and the 21st COP happened in Paris in 2015, and out of that we had the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was hugely significant, as I'm sure many of you know. 195 countries committed to limiting global warming to 2 degrees and pursuing limiting it to 1.5. And one of the reasons it's so significant is because of the history of failure within these international climate negotiations up to that point. And part of the reason for that was that previously the negotiations were structured sort of around quantifying the amount of carbon that could be emitted by different countries, and then trying to allocate countries to have different carbon budgets. And politically, countries did not get on with that top-down approach. There was lots of disputes about what was fair or wasn't fair. And so this Paris Agreement kind of works in the reverse. So rather than the UN process centrally determining the carbon emissions of countries, countries are invited to make their own carbon commitments. And these are called NDCs, that stands for Nationally Determined Contributions, so called because they are contributions that are nationally determined. And the idea behind these is that every 5 years, countries put forward their NDC, and every 5 years, those should increase in the level of ambition. And then that should be pooled centrally to kind of show what the progress is, and that will just keep increasing towards a kind of global net zero in mid-century. So it's the idea of kind of a ratcheting ambition internationally over the coming decades. This is one of the reasons that COP26 is so important. It's because it's the first year that countries have had to resubmit their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. So if you like, it's almost a bit of a proof of concept about whether this new system or new order or new agreement is actually going to work in terms of real-term emission cuts over the coming century. Because of the focus within the Paris Agreement on 1.5 and 2 degrees, there was a landmark report that I'm sure you will all remember coming out in October 2018 by the IPCC, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that report was focused just on the half-degree difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Because those kind of figures became so politically significant, that report was looking at backing that up scientifically. And even with the very scientific and very rigorous language, this is what they say within that report, that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred million. And I'm sure that's something that we're all kind of vaguely aware of, but I think in a conversation like this, it's important just to be reminded of when we're talking about these abstract climate negotiations and what that means internationally, that actually that has very significant real world consequences for real people and real places. And that's what's at stake here at COP26. I apologise for this slide, it's just a lot of information, so I realise that it's unhelpful. But I think what is helpful about it is that it kind of shows in a graph format where we are and where we need to be instead. And these graphs are taken from the United Nations Environment Programme. It's their emissions gap report, and it's the latest one, it's 2020. And you'll see on the left, this is kind of where we are, how we're doing at the moment. So the intervals at the bottom run from 2015 to 2030. So we're a third of the way through. And then it shows the kind of 2/3 of the graph is where we're headed. So rather than the top line, which is business as usual, without any international agreements, we're headed for where that red line is, which in other words is 56 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions in the year 2030. So it's a reduction from where we will be, or without that, which would be about 59. But you'll see that this is compatible on the left with 3.2 degrees of warming this century. So we've just spoken about 1.5 and 2 degrees, but actually that's way out of line with where we're headed. And then on the other side, you can see 1.5 degrees, what that would actually look like. And you can see this really steep line down to 2030, where it'll be 25 gigatons. And I think this is like a really helpful reminder for where we should really be headed over this next decade, is like halving of emission levels per year from where we are now, which is a huge, huge change. And I think, well, it's really good that we have the Paris Agreement. It's a huge landmark. I think one of the dangers of it is that it becomes so far removed from what our actual circumstances are in terms of the real action that countries are taking. And so that's the pressure being put on this COP, is that those NDCs, which are submitted every 5 years, therefore makes this COP26, one of 2 times during this decade when we should be more than halving the rate of our emissions per year, when countries can increase their ambition. And I just think that's quite missing from some of the discourse around COP26 and the focus of some of the conversations. And taken from that same report is this line at the bottom, which says the levels of ambition in the Paris Agreement must be roughly tripled to meet the 2 degrees pathway and increased at least 5-fold for the 1.5 degrees pathway. That's huge, because it means that actually what the UK government should be doing is not just asking countries to be ambitious, but to raise the level of ambition by like orders of magnitude. It's not by degrees, it's by orders of magnitude. It's a huge, huge shift. And that's what makes this year's COP so important, is that we need to see the international community start to signal that really key shift, and where countries don't do that, a real condemnation of inaction, and we'll see what happens. In terms of, and I'm speaking personally, just as a reminder, what I think a successful COP would look like would be new 2030 targets in line with a global real zero pathway. So there's a lot of focus on net zero in 2050, but actually 2050 isn't that far away. Every year between now and then is like 3% of the time we have, and there are huge shifts that we have to make during that time, but a lot of the commitments being made don't deal with this near-term immediate decade, and so I think a successful COP would make that focus happen. Finance and debt relief, especially important because of COVID-19. A lot of the financing commitments, promises that have been made up to date just aren't in the realm of where they really need to be. And I guess there's a distinction to be made between finance that is for mitigation versus for adaptation, and who pays and how that happens. And then finally, a strong signal that the fossil fuel era is coming to an end. We still have like 80% of the world's energy coming from fossil fuels, and that is a major thing that really needs to change, and really needs to change quickly. And it's something that the mid-century 2050 net zero targets kind of disguise, is that a lot of fossil fuel companies will have these targets for 2050 net zero, but actually they're relying on offsetting, and the maths of that doesn't work. Something I won't go into here. So then moving on to UK as host. So in climate diplomacy, if you host it, you own it. So it makes what the host is doing really important. The UK so far is not being a model host. We've had, you can see on the left, just a list of things that have happened recently. Some of its flagship policies, like the Green Homes Grant, has just come to an end. And this is really in a year that everything should be ramping up, and all UK policy should be in line with this summit, and everything should be reasoned, spoken about in line with this summit. And the UK should be hoping to generate huge international headlines for all the right reasons. And at the moment, we're getting headlines for all the wrong reasons. So given the kind of extent of ambition increase that we would want to see, this is a really poor start from the UK in terms of its hosting responsibilities, and not at all what we want. It should be the focus of really everything. And I think the UK presidency has come under a little bit of scrutiny as well for what it's announced as its priority areas. They've come under criticism for just being a bit woolly and a bit multi-direct. Like, it doesn't, you know, they're all good areas. They're all areas where we need progress and we need real action. But there's not a strong signal of the direction that the UK wants to take and what it wants the legacy of this COP to actually be. So that is the real worry. So moving on from some context, and I realise I've painted a somewhat bleak picture, and I'm happy to discuss that more in the kind of questions and answers. I'll move on to what we can do. And I'm mostly going to talk about things that I'm involved with because it's what I know, but then I'll also kind of give you an overview of some of the other things as well. So in my work for Hope for the Future, I work with MPs. I know that some people are like, oh, I mean, why would you bother with MPs, and what do MPs really have to do, given that this is COP, which is like an international process, and MPs are in Parliament. And I guess the first thing to say is that it's, I think, a really helpful analogy is with the Olympics. So if you think back to 2012, the Olympics were, not delivered by Parliament. They weren't arranged by Parliament, but MPs were discussing the legacy of the Olympics. They were discussing what the UK would look like on the international stage. They were overseeing the preparations, sometimes being quite vocal about where they saw issues with it. And we should be seeing more of that with something like COP26. And there's a sense that actually not all MPs are fully up to speed with what is happening as part of COP26, or what their role is within kind of government oversight of their preparations. Engaging with MPs is something that takes a lot of energy, and it's something that to do well you need to do over time. Just to talk through maybe one case study, actually looking at time, we've seen constituents approach with and generally say things, and this is definitely the case for Alex Chalk, oh, he just toes the government party line, like we can't really get anywhere with him. And in the case of Alex Chalk, we had a constituent meeting with him. He agreed to put in some written parliamentary questions, that was good. He then met with sixth form students and was presented with different climate change campaigning. We ran a local event around solar energy, and that event was the first time he sort of conceded that that maybe the government had more to do. But actually, over that process, he's become more engaged with climate, to the extent that he was one of the MPs that put forward the net zero legislation that then went through in June 2019. And you can see his comment on his website following that around the importance of engaging with MPs, and he calls climate change an existential issue, which is definitely not what he would have done at the point that we first engaged with him. So I guess it's just a reminder that long-term engagement with decision makers on this is really important, that it's not just a flash in the pan, but that actually over time you can influence what they're doing within Parliament. I'm running a churches programme at the moment, helping churches engage politically with this. That's about to run again. There's a new cohort starting at the end of April. So if people are interested in finding more about that, please do email me, and I will be happy to give you more information. I'm just going to skip these because of time, but there are other MPs that we've worked with, unsurprisingly. So yeah, talk with your MPs ahead of COP. It demonstrates public appetite for action. You can help your MP work out what they should do in Parliament. They're not necessarily going to work it out for themselves, but if it's presented to them on the plate by a constituent, they're likely to say yes, and building towards a relationship over the longer term. And we have a resource around meeting MPs on COP26 specifically, and the different ways that you might want to do that. It's quite long and it's quite detailed, so you probably will want a bit of support to navigate that. But if you want access to that, again, do email me and I'll be more than happy to support anyone trying to engage their MP on COP26. So I'm now going to speak to something else. This is the Relay to COP26, which is being organised by YCCN, which is Young Christian Climate Network. And I guess one of the big things looking ahead to COP that sometimes comes out of when you're talking to decision makers who are involved with the COP process, they're like, well, what we really need is like a lot of noise, a lot of public noise that is saying this is really important, and we need to see mass mobilizations of different people within civil society saying that and reiterating it, and putting the pressure, I guess, like XR was able to do in terms of pushing climate change up the political agenda, like the same thing, but around COP26. And I know that there are various ways of doing this. This is particularly aimed at Christians and UK churches, getting them involved and trying to unite some of the other different things that are already happening, that are happening on a perhaps slightly slower, lower level or a different level. So it's a 750-mile route. It's got 10 city stops. They're called residency hubs. And it's the kind of advocacy angle is all around climate finance. Churches have done a lot of campaigning around international aid in the past and debt cancellation, and actually we really need to link that to climate and get churches talking about it, and that seems like a good way in, and something that's really important. You might have, well, you might not, it only launched a couple of days ago, but there is a video on social media to launch the YCSIN relay that you can share with others. It's all on our website, and these are the things that we want to campaign around: reinstating foreign aid, doubling the commitment of climate finance within the COPs, and developing a new regulated climate loss and damage mechanism. Loss and damage is a little bit niche, but it's something that climate vulnerable countries in particular talk a lot about, and the UK government wants to lump loss and damage in with adaptation, but it's different. It's when countries are affected by loss and damage because of climate change, whether that is things like weather-related disasters or a number of other things. Where do they turn? What's the mechanism for dealing with that? And it's both economic, but it's also non-economic losses as well. So things like whole countries just disappearing, so that's relevant for some small island states, but also things like in the midst of disaster, like the literal roof of museums being lifted off and cultural artifacts being blown away. What do we do with that? What's the mechanism? And so it's a huge push of climate vulnerable countries within the COP process at the moment, but it's one that wealthier countries such as the UK absolutely do not want to budge on, because they don't want to be they don't want to be liable for anything, and they don't want the discourse to shift in terms of compensation. But it's a real area where faith groups using a moral voice can be a huge help to other organisations who might not be able to say this for various other political reasons. So it's something that we'd love to see UK churches speaking out on. And one way of doing this is looking at things like debt cancellation and ways of making sure that countries aren't going further into debt because they're trying to tackle climate change and the impacts of climate change in their countries. And actually, for a lot of climate vulnerable countries, the cost of capital to them is far higher than it should be. So in terms of getting involved with this relay, I'm just screenshotting our website here, but there are 4 main areas. There's coming and joining on the route itself. There are residencies, so the events happening in cities. There's tributaries, so if you're not on the route, you can find a route and make one yourself and join up for this. And there are other forms of participation as well, both in terms of media, events, content creation, lots of other things. I'm going to show quite a confusing organogram, but basically, if over on the left-hand side, so there's route sections, there are 20 route sections as part of this relay, and we need team leaders for each of them to coordinate volunteers as part of the route. And then we also need residency hub team leaders, so that's the stuff happening within cities, and volunteers to do with that, as well as an array of different roles. So whatever your skills, wherever you are in the country, there are ways that you can support this, and we would absolutely love your help because we're all 18 to 30 and doing this in our voluntary time. That'd be great. And there are a number of like campaigning actions that are associated with this, that guidance is also on their website for within the local celebration guide if you want to go find that. And then finally, the main other thing to talk about is Make COP Count, which is part of the Faith for the Climate COP26 Faith Task Force group. They have 2 advocacy aims. You'll see that they're also aligned around climate finance. That's a big focus of the faith advocacy this year, picking up on an end to the use of public money to subsidise fossil fuels. You might be aware of the recent UK export finance ban. It's kind of building on that and saying, actually, there's a broader issue here. We're still subsidising fossil fuels with public money and we should stop. And then also new and additional sources of finance for loss and damage again. And there's a main postcard action associated with this that guidance is going up on the website for, and fits in with a postcard action that Christian Aid are running. And there will be a microsite all around Make COP Count. It's not up yet, but it will be, and that will be a great place to look. In the meantime, go to the Faith for the Climate website and sign up for their mailing list, because as soon as it's up, it will go out to that mailing list. And find a variety of other things that are happening around this. So there's the COP26 coalition. That's very grassroots, lots of different events by different people around COP26. They have a Slack channel where you can join in with their internal comms. It's a little bit unwieldy, that Slack channel, but it is a hub of lots of action. The Climate Coalition are running the Great Big Green Week. That's in September. They've only just launched their website, but you can sign up for mailings around it. There's not very much information about what's actually happening yet, but you know, I'm sure it will come. There's an action being arranged by some, I think mostly like development agencies around the G7, which is called #WaveOfHope, and it's getting you to put like a handprint or the prints of animals in your window. They haven't done the kind of resources for that. So there's nothing publicly available yet, so I can't really put it on here, but do watch out for it and know that it's coming. A lot of the kind of international development agencies and organisations are involved in a Crack the Crises campaign, which is around the idea that all these crises that we're going through at the moment are interlinked. As far as I know, there's not very much that you can actually concretely join in with as an individual, but like it's interesting to be aware of and, you know, look at. So those are all the kind of top ones. Then you can kind of see the Christian specific ones at the bottom. I'm sure most of you hopefully will be aware of Climate Sunday, which is the joint project being run by Church Together in Britain and Ireland. There's a Methodist focused campaign called Climate Justice for All. There's Climate Intercessors, which is around prayer ahead of COP26. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Prayer and Fast for the Climate. That happens on the 1st of each month. And this is similar / building up on that, but COP26 specific. So do sign up to that on the website and get their mailing lists and join in with their prayer calls. And then finally, there's also Get to Glasgow, which is organised by a group of families near Peterborough, Norwich, and they are walking the distance to COP just locally. So lots of different things going on that to be aware of as well. I know I've said a lot of information, so I will be very pleased to answer questions, and thanks again for having me speak.
Wow, well, thank you so much for that, Rachel. That was absolutely stunning. My head is reeling with the things that you gave us and the information. What we thought we would now do is just give a chance to break out for, we said 6 minutes, so 5 minutes plus a minute callback. Just break out and reflect with your virtual next door neighbours on what was it that stood out for you, that maybe tugged at your heartstrings or your brain or your passion, that you can then chat about and bring back in 5 minutes to ask Rachel about or discuss with Rachel about. So that's what we're going to do now. Is that right, Barbara? So over to you. Okay, I think, well, we're pretty well back now. Most of it will be here. So really, it's now up to discussion, you know, with issues, questions, thoughts, particularly for Rachel. So if you're able to put your hand up, either physically or better still through the reactions piece, let's get going. So, Chich.
Thanks. Just a question worrying me on the politics of it. Last year, before the conference was cancelled, there seemed to be some point scoring between the Scottish and English governments. And it'd be a terrible shame if that sort of stuff starts happening now, when there's such an important issue at stake. Is there any possibility of avoiding that kind of thing about who's organising this properly, not the Scottish Parliament, etc.?
Rachel.
So it's kind of quiet on that front. They're not the same level of headlines, and I suspect that I don't know, there might have been a bit of a realization by people that that's really important to avoid. But I do see some glimpses of difference between the Scottish government, or murmurings of them wanting to have input on things which aren't necessarily being responded to by the COP26 unit. down in Westminster. I'm sure they're keen to avoid it, but whether or not there's, you know, the joined up collaboration is a different question. I don't really know behind the scenes.
Thank you for that. And the next on the list is Ruth Ritter.
Hi, Rachel. I was interested in, I was just saying to our group that the thing that struck me was the importance of our ambition as you know, the UK's ambition, and to sort of leave a legacy. And you mentioned that our presidency themes are not very strong. So if we are engaging our MPs on this, which is something that a group of friends of mine are planning to do with a Tory MP, what would you suggest are the themes that, or how could those be made stronger, or what, you know, what kind of within that would be a positive way forward?
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't try and push too much on the themes, because I think it should go in a different direction, but I think they're not going to change those themes now because they basically can't. But I think one of the big things would be around adaptation and resilience. That theme, that's where I was mentioning loss and damage. The UK government just want to say that that's part of adaptation, and it isn't. And getting some nuance there is really important. But with a Tory MP, that's probably going to be quite difficult. I would push much harder on the lever of this is a really important moment for the UK to use its leverage in terms of you know, being on the international stage, but also I guess that's also why there's a focus around finance, is because actually the UK being host for both the G7 in June and at COP26 at November is a huge opportunity, and as a country that is a major financial player should be making that like a real strength that they can run with and have real influence in with both other governments internationally and some of the kind of different governmental, intergovernmental bodies that control financial systems.
Oh, that's really helpful. That's really, really helpful. Let's go over to Sandra.
Yes, with various groups, we're wondering how far to focus all the action. We two of us lived in Manchester area, and the groups were involved with our planning actions at various times. But is there any point in kind of thinking to getting to Glasgow and planning for it, and what kind of things could we take? I mean, some of us went to the arms fair, for instance, and there were things that you could make and take there that other people in the locality had made. So do we know what will be happening in Glasgow?
We don't know what's going to be happening in Glasgow, and actually the UK government are saying suspiciously little about what is going to be happening in Glasgow itself. I'm not sure how many people will be aware of like the different zones that are part of COP, but the green zone is where a lot of civil society action is. All the organisations have put in their bids to be part of that space and to be part of the kind of wider action there, and they will find out in May whether or not they're successful. But there's still this major uncertainty of how do you have 30,000 people from 195 countries come to one city in the context of COVID, and at the moment like a third wave happening in Europe and all the rest of it. And that hasn't been answered by the UK government. But if they were going to scale COP down, the obvious thing for them to do would be for them to be very strict on who is in the city itself, and basically eliminating or making the green zone digital or completely virtual or hybrid or whatever it is. Usually action within the cities, the host cities of various COPs, is hugely important. Whether that's actually possible this year is still a little bit of an open question. And so I think it's worth being minded to and considering, but also considering different scenarios. And you might want to favour some of the civil society action in September, both as being ahead of COP, when, you know, in November, actually some decisions will have, you know, delegations will already have their briefs, sort of thing. but also given COVID.
Yeah, I was wondering whether the one thing I could do would be for my grandchildren would be to turn up with a banner. Is that the one thing that will make a difference? It'll just to be there. But I don't know. This is the kind of help that we need to have. And John and Vanessa Purdy asked a similar question. I think next on the list is Sarah Hall.
Yes, in my area, most of the large and successful churches are evangelical, and they're really hot on social action. They've been doing wonderful things during COVID, but at the moment, the climate doesn't seem to be top priority. I'm wondering if there are any theological resources that would be particularly helpful for people in the evangelical sides of the church.
Yeah, there are a number of resources that I can think of, almost too many that it's that I can't narrow them down. I think I would point towards Tearfund's new toolkit for churches. I think that is good messaging for more evangelical churches. There's also a series from the Lausanne network. What is that called? It's at the At Your Service A Rocha International website, and it's a series of like 12 videos that's very good and addresses quite a lot of kind of evangelical theological concerns. Yeah, so I'd try that, but do email me and I might give you a more comprehensive answer than that, Sarah.
And next, in a fortnight's time, we will have the co-chair of Green Christian, Deborah Tompkins, to really telling us at these sessions what the scriptures say to believers about creation care. So, you know, there are some really good resources around, and if you come in a couple of weeks if you're interested in that. I think next on the list is Helena Mccluskey.
Except it's Paul who's got the question.
Yes, I got volunteered. I was interested in the references to debt because one of the things that was successful a number of years ago was the Millennium Development Goals, and they've transformed into something called donut economics. And I just wondered if everybody knew about donut economics. If they don't, I've no way of having a straw poll. I can certainly put something out, because I think it's a wonderful way of integrating the Millennium Development Goals with the finite nature of our single planet, you know, so that everybody has enough, but nobody uses too much. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next, well, over to you, Rachel. Do you have any comment?
Yeah, I think just to say the Millennium Development Goals are now the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. That's it.
I think Zoe.
It's a sort of comment, really. Thank you, Rachel, hugely. But also, when people are talking about going to COP, I am myself hoping to be in Glasgow, depending on what's happening. But there's a number of us also going to be in Cornwall, and it would be lovely to sort of meet up with the relay that's happening from Cornwall. And I was really interested about what you were saying about the moral voice of the churches. I think that mobilisation of that is just so important. So yeah, I'll go back to those sort of resources that you've given us. Thank you.
And then we've got Sophie Franklin.
So yes, my comment is really on the goals of people, countries giving their target for 2030, but you were on COP26, which was sure to happen in 2020. So shouldn't we have a more urgent target of 2025? Even if the countries don't want to think about that, should we not push for, you know, a target 5 years from where it should be, which is 25?
Do you have a thought on that, Rachel?
I mean, yes. I guess there's a difference between what should be happening anyway and what is politically possible and feasible. The UK has set an NDC, which is for 2030. So they have done okay on this. So their 2030 NDC is a reduction of 68% of emissions versus the 1990 deadline. So I guess we're up to about 43% of a cut as of this moment from 1990. So it's a further kind of 20+% over the next decade. So they have led by example in the sense of setting a 2030 target, which is pretty meaningful in terms of that was aligned with the Climate Change Committee. Yeah.
Okay, but are they going to get there?
That's another question.
Sorry.
Not hugely confident at this very moment in time, but you know, they could do it if they wanted to.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, any more? Yes, Christopher.
Rachel, you talked a lot about the importance of debt relief and increasing foreign aid. And of course, we know the decision has been made recently to reduce foreign aid quite substantially. Now, that is very controversial, and there are a lot of people at a senior level in the Conservative Party and close to government who think it's a mistake. So I just wondered whether potentially that's something we might have some traction. You know, some of the things that we want to happen, we know just aren't. But this seems to me something where we might, you know, potentially might be able to change that policy. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the reason why that's on there as part of the asks for that relay is being like, this is an easy win. Like that should be, you know, very straightforward to achieve with a good amount of push. I used to work for Stephen Timms, who's a Labour MP for East Ham, and he would always say that churches were a really instrumental part of achieving the cross-party consensus at the time that it should be 0.7% of GDP. So it would be really good to see churches mobilising again to get it reinstated, and that should be very achievable if there was a big push behind it.
Now, I saw just now, John Logan, you had, you actually did a clap hand. I possibly misread it. And maybe you asked a question, which is a raise hand. Were you applauding or asking?
Just a follow-up really to being in Glasgow and accepting what you've said about not knowing what the impact of COVID is going to be. Very often for this sort of event, the local churches are mobilised to offer hospitality, somewhere to pitch a tent on a lawn, this sort of thing. Do you know whether any of that is being prepared? Because obviously all the commercial stuff will be booked out.
Yeah, it is. It's being led on by Stephen Curran, who's the eco-congregation lead there. There's plans for a human hotel, is the name being given to it, which is going to be an online platform providing like informal accommodation for activists. That's not launched yet, but there's been like a big push to get faith spaces as part of that, and the Scottish churches have been very proactive, and the lead for that is
and I have to.
Is at Friends for the Earth Scotland.
And I have to give an apology to John, because you did send an email earlier today asking that very question, and Rachel answered it. So so apologies. Now we noticed that Helen Price, I don't know if you were applauding or you were asking a question.
I just wanted to ask a question. The thing that shocked me greatly from Rachel's presentation was the huge gap between where we need to get to and where we are now. And I just wanted to ask about a couple of big hits that we could challenge our MPs about. Just where would you target? Where would we have big hits, quick wins?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's quite a hard question because it really depends on your MP. But depending on where they are, I think some really obvious things is just making sure that there aren't any major like policy decisions being made that just completely undermine the UK as host. The obvious one here is the Cumbrian mine. That does now have a public inquest happening in September, but that's not in time for like November. And things like at the moment they're looking at introducing a cut on domestic air passenger duty, something like that. Things like that, there needs to be like obvious and immediate pressure from MPs as a backlash as the UK prepares to be COP26 host. The other thing is that the UK has said that it will announce its net zero strategy. I think that used to have a deadline of September of this last year, 2020, and it's been kicked into the long grass again. But really you would hope that the UK was coming forward with that very clearly and strongly and being like, this is how we're getting to our climate commitments, and kind of showing that it can be done by implementing those policies themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now we have got Daniel raising a hand. Also, Chich and Zoe, you still have raised hands. I want to make sure that so neither of you got. That's fine. So it's only it's Daniel. Yeah.
Hi there. I was just wanting to ask if there was anything around the climate and ecological or environmental emergency, whichever one it is, bill that's been around for a while now and seems to be gathering a bit of momentum. I just wonder if that's something that we could be sort of pushing in relation to COP26, because I mean, you know, if the UK can show that we're serious about putting some legislation into place that will actually make some difference here, that would surely give a good message. I've really no idea of, you know, I mean, I know there are MPs getting on board, but whether it's a realistic chance of getting this through, I don't know. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on it or anything that we could be doing around that.
Yeah, so I have strong personal opinions here, but I know that there will be people who think very differently from me on this on the call. So that's a caveat aside. But I'm wary of it because it doesn't have any Conservative MPs backing it. I suspect Conservative MPs have been told that they can't back it because there's been so little on it. But without, the only way that that will get pushed through is if there's government support, or like that it, because it's a private member's bill as well, it's not going to go through on a parliamentary session. So it's not going anywhere unless it gets adopted across the House. And at the moment that hasn't happened. And I think part of the reason is that it wasn't, they probably should have launched the campaign initially having sounded out a few Conservative MPs and got them on board initially, and because that didn't happen, it hasn't happened. And therefore one of the good things about UK climate politics is that there is cross-party consensus on its importance, even if that isn't necessarily followed through with coherence on an agreement on policies. But to lose that by pushing something like the CE bill, I think would be difficult to see, and it's not. I'm not convinced personally that it should be a campaigning priority for this year ahead of COP.
I'm sure there will be other views on that, but I think we now have time for one last question from Charles.
Yes, was something I think we learned from you, Rachel, last year in your training for the Climate Coalition events. So we have a right-wing MP. I've put it in the chat, but the question we asked is, do you feel drawn to the UK being able to make friends and influence people through its most attractive assets, notably culture, education, language and values, and lead the way with technological and scientific expertise, which the climate crisis requires? And he suddenly engaged. And we formed a relationship. I'm not sure where it's going, but it was a question that worked well. And so thank you for that. I've put the question in the chat if people want to try it.
Thank you. Rachel, any last comment?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's so much to say on this topic, as we've already kind of seen, and I'd love to continue the conversation if people want to do that.
Well, what we commit to is to letting people go to their evenings and families after 1 hour. And so we're going to do that in a moment. But I'm going to do a closing prayer and then disappear if you want to, or stay on and chat if you want to. This is an excerpt from Bruce Sanguin's poem, Living Earth's Wisdom. We tune our ears to the wisdom of earth. It is deep prayer, this listening to her cries. As spirits sighs, too deep for words. Unborn generations call to us from the future. What did you do when the planet could no longer bear your foolishness and began to break? Let those with ears to hear rise up. Amen. So thank you very much. If you'd now like to go, that would be great. In 2 weeks' time, Deborah Tompkins, co-chair of Green Christian, will be speaking to us in a Bible discussion. What does Scripture say to believers about creation care? So we can get into what are the real nitty-gritty arguments in there. So we're looking forward to that. If you'd like to stay on, then stay on. We can chat more informally. Otherwise, you can disappear off. I will send through to you the materials, the chat from today, the slides, and a quick feedback questionnaire for you, just to tell us in a minute how it went for you. Thank you very much. We'll give a minute to let people disappear, and then we'll continue the discussion.